Hello and welcome back to another video. Let's discuss secure synopsis of 3rd of April 2021 because there is no synopsis for today's date, that is 7th of April, and that is the reason why we are going to take up the synopsis of 3rd of April, which we have not done. Okay, and thank you so much for having looking at the video that I make, and thank you, Jiju, for motivating me. Okay, so let's get started. General Studies 1, and the topic under that is on the medical termination pregnancy bill. So basically this is about women's rights. This is also about health sector, and this can also be asked in the sociology and also in the social issues section of general studies 1. Okay, so let's get started. The question here is: the medical termination of pregnancy bill 2020 continues to ignore pregnant persons' rights. Critically evaluate in the context of gender rights. So this question basically talks about the pregnancy rights that women have. So state is intervening in the women's rights. So whenever a woman wants to terminate her pregnancy, she has the rights to do it. But because the state is intervening in it and specifying certain number of weeks, let's say 20 to 24 weeks, and also telling those women to take approval from a set of doctors under a particular medical board. So these kind of intervention, this kind of interference of the state into women's rights is actually not right. So that is the kind of article this is, and let us have a look at the provisions of the medical termination of pregnancy bill 2020 also. Okay, so let's get started. So we'll have to critically evaluate in the context of the gender rights. That is the ask of the question. So Rajya Sabha recently passed the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Amendment Bill 2021, and this was passed by the lower house in 2020, and recently Rajya Sabha passed it. So now it will go to the president for the final assent, and once the president signs into the bill, it will become a law and everybody has to obey it. And if somebody has a problem with that law, they can raise that issue through a petition in the Supreme Court. And if the Supreme Court finds that this is not a good law, it can actually destroy it or tell that this law should be relooked upon. Okay, now let's have a look at the provisions. So this is an important bill that seeks to enhance the reproductive rights of women in India. The bill seeks to amend the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act 1971. So earlier there was an act in 1971. After almost 40 years, a new act has been 50 years, almost 50 years, a new act has been created, that is Medical Termination of Pregnancy, which is an amendment bill. Okay, this act covers abortions in India. It had been amended in 1975 and also in 2002. 1975 when Indira Gandhi government was there, and 2002 when the Vajpayee government was there. So before the enactment of this legislation, abortion was prohibited under Section 312 of the Indian Penal Code. So thankfully, because of this medical termination of pregnancy bill, women were able to take it up and get their child aborted, fetus aborted. And earlier this was a penal offense under section 312 of the Indian Penal Code. Okay, now let's have a look at the body of this. The first provision under this is enhanced upper limit of 20 to 24 weeks for special categories of women, right? So earlier it was 20 weeks, and now women can abort until 24 weeks. Next is the no upper gestational limit for terminating pregnancies with substantial fetal abnormalities diagnosed by medical board. So there is no upper limit until the last final stage. Also, the baby can be aborted if there are any fetal abnormalities. It will strengthen access to comprehensive abortion care under strict conditions without compromising service and quality of safe abortion. So main emphasis is given on service and quality. It is a step towards safety and well-being of women, because usually whenever there is abortion that's happening, it might affect the health of the woman also. So that is also taken into consideration, and it will ensure dignity, autonomy, confidentiality, and justice for women who need to terminate pregnancy. Because there are instances where women might have faced rapes, and without contraceptives they would have gone through the intercourse, and and the fetus would have been formed. And in those circumstances, earlier it was a criminal offense under 312 if at all the woman wanted to abort. But because of this bill, women have got back their rights of deciding their own body on what needs to be done. Now, proposed features of the new bill are: the bill permits abortion to be allowed up to 20 weeks on the opinion of just one medical practitioner. Earlier, it was more than one. To terminate pregnancies between 20 to 24 weeks, the opinion of two doctors are required. So, this extension of the gestation period up to 24 weeks is given for special categories of women, such as rape victims and differently abled women and minors. So, I don't know what is the difference between a normal woman and women who have been affected by rape. End of the day, it is still the pregnancy that is happening. So, that is the kind of criticism you can mention if at all you are asked to do so. For abortions beyond 24 weeks, a state level medical board will decide if it can be permitted in case of substantial fetal abnormalities. So, again, there is a state intervention here. The board will consist of a gynecologist, pediatrician, a radiologist, and or sonographer, and any other number of members as notified by the state government. Only doctors with specialization in gynecology and obstetrics can perform abortions, and nobody else. According to the bill, the name and other particulars of a woman whose pregnancy has been terminated shall not be revealed. So there is some amount of privacy also given here, that names shall not be revealed except to a person authorized by law. Maybe her husband can know about it, or her family members. In cases where abortions are desired to terminate pregnancies arising out of rape, where the gestation period exceeds 24 weeks, the only manner would be through a writ petition. So look at the kind of hazards or hassles that a woman has to face. If it exceeds beyond 24 weeks, she has to put a writ petition in the Supreme Court or a High Court, and she has to go through all the court, normalities. And I don't know how it would be possible for a woman who is already carrying to go through all this kind of writ petition, moving the courts, and also reaching out to the medical board. So it's a little difficult. So that is the kind of criticism that you can provide. The rationale behind the amendments. Why were the amendments required? The government reasoned that this extension is significant because some women realize the need for an abortion after the first 20 weeks of pregnancy. Very nice. It has given some room to women's realization. Next is usually the fetal anomaly scan is done during the 20th or 21st week of pregnancy, and that is the reason it has been extended to 24 weeks. If there is a delay in doing this scan and it reveals a lethal anomaly in the fetus, 20 weeks is limiting. The extension of limit would ease the process for the distressed pregnant women, allowing the mainstream system itself to take care of them, delivering quality medical attention. So, extension of the limit, the government says it will ease the process for the distressed pregnant women. Now let's have the look at the significance of this bill. The move to amend the MTB Act 1971 is a progressive step towards empowerment of women. Yes, absolutely. Women have got back their rights in deciding what they want to do with their bodies. It will provide greater reproductive rights to women, as abortion is considered an important aspect of the reproductive health of women. Deaths and injuries from unsafe abortions are largely preventable provided services are performed legally by trained practitioners. Requirement of trained practitioners. Raising the upper limit of legal abortions from 20 weeks to 24 weeks for special categories of women, including rape and incest survivors, other vulnerable women, and children. So it's a good welcome step. It will completely be removing the upper gestation limit for abortion in the cases of substantial fetal abnormalities. This is very nice. Instead of giving birth to a fetus which will have huge amount of abnormalities, and the rest of the life would be spent on taking care of the child. So government is allowing, or they're completely removing the upper gestation limit for aborting fetal abnormal cases, and this will help many more seek a safe and legal abortion services, allowing all women and not just married ones to legally seek abortions, and striking out the need for the opinion of a second registered practitioner for aborting pregnancies up to 20 weeks. So this is a welcome step. And yes, so if earlier there was a ban on it, right? So in 312 of the Indian Penal Code, and those times women were going to unhygienic conditions and they were getting aborted, and it is said that almost 1 lakh illegal abortions happen in India, and this particular bill is a welcome step in stopping those kind of illegal abortions in India. So, comparison of MTP 2021 with MTP 1971. The present law only applies to married. The present law, that is, only applies to married women. Proposed amendments are unmarried women are also covered in it. So it's a welcome step. The present law, which means the law that was there before, and now we are comparing it with the amendments. 20 weeks for all indications. Now it has been raised to 24 weeks, and beyond 24 weeks for fetal abnormalities. One medical practitioner till 12 weeks, and two medical practitioners till 20 weeks. So approval, right? And one medical practitioner till 20 weeks, and 2 medical practitioners up to 24 weeks. So medical board approval after 24 weeks. So substantial amount of room has been given here in terms of opinions required before termination. Breach of the woman's confidentiality, fine of up to rupees 1,000 if at all the name of the woman is revealed out, and fine or imprisonment of 1 year is the present, that is the proposed amendments. Let's have a look at the shortcomings of the bill. Son meta preference. The preference for a male child keeps sex determination centers in business in spite of their illegal status. There are concerns that a more liberal abortion law can aggravate this state of affairs. Right? If there is more liberal abortion law, the husband's or the husband's family would take the women and get that illegal abortion done because of this son preference in India. Fetal viability, a key aspect of the legality governing abortions has always been the viability of the fetus. Viability implies the period from which a fetus is capable of living outside the womb. Currently, viability is usually placed at about 7 months but may occur earlier, even at 24 weeks. Thus, late termination of pregnancy may get in conflict with the viability of the fetus. Non institutional deliveries, this only 22% of 15.6 million abortions happen in the healthcare facilities. There is no record of the others. So, like I said, almost more than, it's here it says that almost more than a lakh abortions happen illegally. We need far more providers at the lower levels of healthcare delivery to ensure safe abortion services reach more women. Lack of awareness of rights. A study of 1,007 women of ages 15 to 24 years in Assam and Madhya Pradesh in November 2018 found only 20% young women know about modern contraceptive methods. So, lack of awareness amongst people. 22% are aware that abortion is legal in India. None of the women surveyed were aware of the correct legal gestation of 20 weeks. So, lack of education, lack of literacy will not enable people in the rural areas to know about this bill and what are the provisions according to their health. Change of choice. The current bill does not consider factors such as personal choice, a sudden change in circumstances due to separation from or a death of a partner and domestic violence. So these kind of things are not given. Some women also say that if a man leaves a marriage and moves out, the woman should also have the right to terminate the baby if the man is moving out, because the man who was responsible for creating that baby is no more there. So she should be having a choice to terminate the baby. So those kind of arguments are also made. Next is medical boards. The present healthcare budgetary allocation makes setting up a board across the country both financially and practically impossible. Access to the board by pregnant women in remote areas of the state is a matter of concern. Not everybody can be able to access these kind of board, and even if they go to that board, what are they going to talk? Not everybody is educated. No time limit set to respond to the requests. The board will subject women to multiple examination before allowing her to terminate her pregnancy. So this will create unnecessary hassles in her life and unwanted complications in her health. This is a violation of right to privacy and right to live with dignity that everybody is entitled to. Way forward, the government needs to ensure that all norms and standardized protocols in clinical practice to facilitate abortions are followed in healthcare institutions across the country. Since everything rests on the delivery, stopping short would undoubtedly make this progressive order a mere half measure. With an estimated 90% of women seeking before 12 weeks gestation, training village level health workers, for example, ASHA's people are there, and then you have auxiliary nurse midwives and nurses to prescribe simple abortion pills will help take safe services to the doorstep of vulnerable women, and in case of complications lead to timely referrals. This gap in services can be addressed in the new rules that will be framed when the amended act is passed. So instead of denying services to women because of the apprehension of untrained practitioners profiting, the government should focus on regulating the healthcare sector to ensure basic quality services such as contraception, safe delivery, and abortion, and are available for asking. So, all these provisions will definitely help the women. Now, let's conclude the answer. The Medical Termination of Pregnancy Amendment Bill 2021 is for expanding access of women to safe and legal abortion services on therapeutic, eugenic, humanitarian, or social grounds. It is the first step towards the safety and well being of the women, and many women will be benefited from this. Absolutely. And recently, several petitions were received by the courts are seeking permission for aborting pregnancies at a gestational age beyond the present permissible limit on grounds of fetal abnormalities or pregnancies due to sexual violence faced by women. Right, because the technology has advanced so much that the bill can actually extend it to full term instead of just restricting it to 20 to 24 weeks. The technology has improved tremendously, and back then it was illegal because there was no proper technology. But now the technology is available, we can extend it to full term. Okay, so hopefully we are getting progressive and liberal in terms of the rights that are given to the people, and hopefully in future, just like how it took 50 years for this bill to form, it might take another 10 to 15 years to realize that full term is available for every woman, and the state should not have any business in interfering with the body of the women, right? So it's our internal matter. Let's move on to the next question. Under the topic General Studies 2, enactment of Places of Worship Act 1991 in its current format damages the liberty of belief, faith, and worship to all. Do you agree? So this article appeared in the Hindu, and this basically talks about Places of Worship Act. Just to give you a brief input about why are we talking about Places of Worship Act. The famous case when it comes to this law is the Babri Masjid demolition case. There is this feeling in India that most of the temples were destroyed by the foreign invaders, especially the Mughals and Sultanate people. And upon that, mosques were built, masjids were built, dargahs were built, and this act basically protects those monuments or those temples that were built upon the temples or they built, and it helps to remain status quo, keep it as status quo after 1947. So before 1947, whatever has happened, but after 1947, when India attained independence, everything has to be looked in the format where none of the communities get affected by the hopes or the feelings of another community, and that is why everything has to be kept in status quo. That is the kind of ask that is the kind of reason that was given in enacting this Places of Worship Act 1991, and this date can be exactly taken into consideration to make it parallel with the Babri Masjid demolition case. Okay, so let's have a look at the provisions and the details under this question. The Places of Worship, that is Special Provisions Act 1991, seeks to maintain the religious character, just maintain the religious character of places of worship as it was in 1947, except in the case of Ram Janmabhoomi Babri Masjid dispute, which was already in court in 1947. So the law was brought in at the peak of the Ram Mandir movement, exactly a year before the demolition of the Babri Masjid. Introducing the law in 1991, the then Home Minister S.B. Chavan said in Parliament that it was adopted to curb communal tension. So the main reason this was enacted was to curb communal tension and not create hatred among Hindu community and the Muslim community, or for that matter, any other religion. Now let's have a look at the background of this. A co-mutawali of 350-year-old Tili Wali Masjid of Lucknow, Wasif Hassan, has approached the Supreme Court seeking intervention in the pending PIL challenging provisions of the Places of Worship Act. So here, Wasif Hassan has approached the Supreme Court on the PILs, that is public interest litigation, challenging all the provisions of the Places of Worship Act. The applicant has opposed the plea, claiming that the petition is a mischievous one which aims at isolating the Muslim community as a separate category from other religious communities in India. Right, so this Places of Worship Act and all the petitions that are filed in Supreme Court is basically aiming at isolating the Muslim community. The Supreme Court asked the center to respond to a plea challenging the Places of Worship Special Provisions Act 1991, which freezes the status of places of worship as it was in the 15th of August 1947. In agreeing to examine the law, the court has opened the doors for litigation in various places of worship across the country, including Mathura and Varanasi. Right, so in examining all these laws and taking up all those petitions, it is actually trying to relook on those temples in Mathura and Varanasi, and those temples that were destroyed and mosques were built upon them. Let's have a look at the provisions of the Act. The objective of the law describes it as an act to prohibit conversion of any places of worship, which is a welcome move. It aims to provide for the maintenance of the religious character of any place of worship as it existed on 15th day of August 1947, and for matters connected therewith or incidental thereto. Don't worry about this lawyer kind of sentences. Just think that it aims to provide maintenance of religious character as it was on 15th day of August 1947. Section 3 and 4 of the Act declared that the religious character of a place of worship shall continue to be the same as it was on August 15, 1947. These two sections categorically specify specifies it. No person shall convert any place of worship of any religious denomination into one of a different denomination or section. Section 4, Clause 2 says that all suits, appeals, or others regarding converting the character of a place of worship that was pending on August 15, 1947 will stand abated when the Act commences and no fresh proceedings can be filed. Main intention is to not let any proceedings to be filed in that particular case. However, legal proceedings can be initiated after the commencement of the act if the change of status took place after the cutoff date of 15th August 1947. What does it say about Ayodhya and what else is exempted? Act does not apply to Ram Janmabhoomi Babri Masjid. It was kept away from this Places of Worship Act 1991. Besides the Ayodhya dispute, the Act also exempted any place of worship that is an ancient and historical monument or archaeological site or is covered by the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Sites and Remains Act in 1958. So all those things that come under this ancient and historical monuments, it has been exempted similar to Ram Janmabhoomi Babri Masjid. A suit that has been finally settled or disposed of, whatever has been settled and disposed of, you cannot get it back into the court. Any dispute that has been settled by the parties or conversion of any place that took place by acquiescence before the act commenced. So anything that happened before can also be taken into consideration. Challenges posed by the law. The law violates the right to practice and propagate religion as well as the right to manage and administer places of worship. The act goes against the principle of secularism and state's duty to preserve and protect religious and cultural heritage. So the state's responsibility is to preserve and protect religious and cultural heritage. Now, because that act is put in place, there can be questions being asked, and the state is actually encouraging those questions, is what this statement says. The cutoff date, 15th of August 1947, as per the law, bars Hindus, Jains, Buddhists, and Sikhs from approaching courts. Right? Just because we attain independence on this day doesn't mean that the temples of Hindus, Jains, Buddhists, Sikhs stopped stopped living after that date. It was there before and it is there after that also. So it is not giving that right to reclaim those places of worship which were invaded, encroached upon by fundamentalist barbaric invaders. So these are the challenges posed by the law. The right wing politicians have opposed the law even when it was introduced, arguing that the center has no power to legislate on pilgrimages or burial grounds which is under the state list. So center has no power to legislate on those subjects that are mentioned in the state list, for example, pilgrimages or burial grounds. Another criticism against the law is that the cutoff date is of date of independence, which means the status quo determined by colonial power is considered final, right? So that is also a probable challenge here, according to the law. Next is Supreme Court's view about the act. In 2019 Ayodhya verdict, the Constitution bench led by former CJI Ranjan Gogoi referred to the law and said it manifests the secular values of the Constitution and strictly prohibits retrogression. In providing a guarantee for the preservation of religious character of the places, Parliament determined that independence from colonial rule furnishes a constitutional basis for healing the injustices of the past. Now, because of that, we have attained independence from colonial rule. It allows us an opportunity to heal the injustices of the past. The law addresses itself to the state as much as to every citizen of the nation. Its norms bind those who govern the affairs of the nation at every level. So those norms implement the fundamental duties under Article 51A and are hence positive mandates to every citizen as well. So it is the duty of every citizen to actually maintain brotherhood and not cause any kind of not get back all those injustices that happened in the past again now and create an atmosphere of disharmony, right? So it is the duty of every citizen to obey the law and to live in harmony. The court reportedly felt that by enacting a law upholding the equality of all religions and secularism and part of the constitution basic structure, the state enforced a constitutional commitment. Let's conclude this question. The Places of Worship Act imposes a non-derogable obligation towards enforcing our commitment to secularism. To reopen the law after such clear and firm words would be unwise and would amount to opening Pandora's box. Because if we reopen this law and start looking at each and every section, it will actually create a lot of despair and lot of bitterness amongst communities wherein you are trying to relook on the injustices of the past, and already a lot of people are praying in their mosques which are probably on the temples, and we have to just leave it as it is right now and not allow these kind of things to prop up again, because it will create an atmosphere of disharmony and there will be riots in the country. Okay, so let's go ahead to the next question. It is, discuss in detail the rationale with which Article 244A was inserted in Indian Constitution and how it differs from Schedule 6th. So this question is on Article 244A and also the Schedule 6 of the Constitution. Let us have a look at what provisions are there under Article 244A and what the Schedule 6 also talks about, which means the sixth schedule. This article appeared in Indian Express. Let's have a look at it. Article 244, Clause A, allows for creation of an autonomous state within Assam. We are talking about an autonomous state within Assam in certain tribal areas. Inserted into the constitution in 1969 and not before that by the then Congress government, it also has a provision for a legislature and a council of ministers. So, an autonomous state that can be created in Assam can also have a legislator and a council of ministers. That is the kind of provision Article 244A gives. What was the rationale behind inserting Article 244A? Article 244A allows for creation of autonomous state, we just saw, and this can be created in certain tribal areas. It envisages creation of a local legislature or council of ministers and to carry out local administration. And this was inserted into the constitution by 22nd Constitutional Amendment Act of 1969. What is it? 22nd Constitutional Amendment Act. And the demand for this is since the 1980s. Implementation in Article 244A prescribes the formation of an autonomous state consisting of certain tribal areas. We just saw that. There has been a demand across three hill districts, namely Karbi Anglong, West Karbi Anglong, and Dima Hasao. So remember Karbi Anglong and Dima Hasao names, these are in Assam. Okay, not in Meghalaya, not in Manipur or Arunachal Pradesh. These two places are in Assam, Karbi Anglong and Dima Hasao. So we are talking about these hill districts wherein the demand has been there from time immemorial. It gives the provision for a legislature and a council of ministers. Same thing has been repeated again and again. Under Article 244, Clause A1, the Parliament may, by law, form within the state of Assam an autonomous state comprising all. So, Parliament has the authority and not the state legislature. Differences from the sixth schedule of the Constitution. The sixth schedule of the Constitution provides for the administration of tribal areas. So, whenever you are asked in the exam, what does sixth schedule of the Constitution actually represent? Just have one thing in mind, it is about tribal areas. It is not about scheduled areas. It is about tribal areas, administration of tribal areas in Assam, Meghalaya. Meghalaya is a state below Assam, Tripura, and Mizoram to safeguard the rights of tribal population in these states. The special provision is provided under Article 244 Clause 2 and Article 275 Clause 1 of the Constitution. In Assam, the hill districts of Dima Hasao, Karbi Anglong, and West Karbi and Bodo territorial region are under this provision. The governor is empowered to increase or decrease the areas or change the names of the autonomous districts, while executive powers of the union extend in scheduled areas with respect to their administration. In fifth schedule, we just discussed, right? Sixth schedule is for fifth schedule. Scheduled areas is for fifth schedule, and sixth schedule talks about tribal areas. So this sixth schedule remains within the executive authority of the state. So center has the power in the fifth schedule, whereas the state has the power in sixth schedule. The fifth schedule of the Constitution deals with the administration and control of scheduled areas and scheduled tribes in any state except the four states of Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura, and Mizoram. The whole of the normal administrative machinery operating in a state do not extend to the scheduled areas. At present, there are 10 states, namely Andhra Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Gujarat, Himachal Pradesh, Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Odisha, Rajasthan, and Telangana, which have fifth scheduled areas. This, if you have a look at these states, they are exactly in the middle of the country. Tribal habitation in the states of Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, West Bengal, Uttar Pradesh, and Jammu and Kashmir have not been brought under the fifth or sixth schedule. The acts of parliament or the state legislature do not apply to autonomous districts and autonomous regions or apply with specified modification exceptions. The councils have also been endowed with wide civil and criminal judicial powers. For example, establishing their own village courts. They don't even have to go to the high court. They can decide their problems within the village courts in their autonomous district. However, the jurisdiction of these councils is subject to the jurisdiction of the concerned high court. Now, if you have to appeal, you will have to go to the high court, right? Let's conclude this question. Special constitutional protections are indeed required for marginalized sections, and that is why fifth schedule and sixth schedule has been inserted in the constitution. And this is required so that historical wrongs done to them are reversed, are not repeated, but it has denied justice to non-tribals who have lived in the ADCs for generations but ended up marginalized. Hence, the government and other agencies need to win the confidence of the tribals and the non-tribals within the region and bring a sense of security and belongingness among them to deal with this sensitive issue. Okay, so it is because it is on the marginalized people, it becomes a sensitive issue. And as an IAS officer, where you have been, if at all you have been deployed in those areas, you will have to be very sensitive to those people over there, whether it is tribal people or non-tribal people. You have to strike a conversation and pacify whatever situation arise over there. Okay. So the next question is on police reforms. Police reforms are very much needed in India because you see a lot of cases where custodial torture happens. People are killed when they are taken to jails by the policemen trying to investigate that person. They don't look at the sensitivity of the issue. They just go on keep beating those people. So police reforms on how the police can be sensitive to the public, on how can they resolve issues, and how can they be friendly with the public and create a community policing forum, how the police can respond to a problem in a faster way, right? So police reforms are very much needed in the country, and this question talks about that. Let us have a look at it. First, let's read the question. By highlighting apex court's direction on police reforms under Prakash Singh judgment, analyze the challenges in implementing the same, right? So let's have a look at it. This article appeared in the Indian Express. The primary role of police forces is to uphold and enforce laws. Who makes the laws? The parliamentarians makes laws, the state legislatures make laws, politicians make laws, police have to uphold and enforce it. That is the primary role of the police. And they also have to investigate crimes and ensure security for the people in the country. Under the constitution, police is a subject governed by the states. There has been almost 30 years of debate on policing and reform in India. The present Indian police system is largely based on Police Act of 1861. Look at the number of years that has passed between 1861 till date, and the police act still survives. And the right, so the Supreme Court has stated that the landmark judgment of the Prakash Singh versus Union of India 2006, which dealt with police reforms, is used periodically only as mantra to suit the occasion whenever it arises. The latest episode of all allegations of lobbying by several IPS officers in Maharashtra and of power brokers deciding on postings in cahoots with the government shows little has changed in the system. We also saw that Sachin Vaze, a person in the Maharashtra government who was junior in rank but given a higher position in the police, shows that politician and police nexus of corruption still exists, and police are not loyal to the people, rather they are loyal to the politicians. And this kind of lobbying by higher officers for postings also shows that there is huge amount of lacunae in the system of the police. Let's have a look at the need for police reforms. If India is to achieve its status as great power, it is absolutely essential that police is restructured and modernized. Without the police ensuring good law and order in the country, the other services would find it difficult to operate. Right? If there is no law and order in a specific area, and the strikes and protests are happening, and people start throwing stones, and usually targets are the shops nearby, if we cannot become a $5 trillion economy if the law and order of the country is not proper. We saw that in Delhi riots when Trump was in India, the Muslims and Hindus fought against the CAA, and how there was a ruckus that was created. All the shops were shut, curfew was put in place, and if there is no business, there is no economic growing, so things will happen that way. So it is very important that law and order has to be maintained for India to reach a status of great power. To transform the colonial police structure of the country into a progressive, modern force sensitive to the democratic aspirations of the people is very, very necessary. It is seen like police are the new legal rowdies, and nobody is going to question them because of the uniform that they have on their body, and they start taking money from roadside vendors and start collecting from people who appear as vulnerable. So this is the way police operates. To eliminate the undue political interference, the police of today are victims of politicization as well as criminalization. To instill the confidence of the people in the institution of police by making police more people friendly, So people-friendly police is needed. The security of the society and the welfare of the people is dependent on the efficiency of the police. Only when police is efficient, the society is secure, and people's welfare is taken care of. The key reasons entering both police reforms. One example that I would like to give you here is when father and son were killed in a police custody in Tamil Nadu. The India nation and the world started talking about this torture, custodial deaths, and how police do not are not at all sensitive to the aspirations of the people, and they treat people as some kind of rats. They beat up, they take money from them, and loot completely. So there should be police reforms to reform the police and allowing them to be sensitive and also to understand the aspirations of the people. Let's have a look at the reasons that are hindering both police reforms. First and foremost is an overburdened police force. Police force is overburdened, especially at lower levels where constabulary is forced to work continuously 14 to 16 hours and also for 7 days a week. It adversely impacts their performance. They are also humans, and they should be given enough amount of rest. If they're working for 14 to 16 hours, they're always angry, right? While the sanctioned police strength was 181 police per lakh persons in 2016, when the United Nations recommended standard is 222 police per lakh person, right? So UN says have 202 police per lakh persons, but we just have 181 police per lakh persons, and this data is as of 2016. 86% of the state police comprises of constabulary. Constables are typically promoted once during their service. This could weaken their incentive to perform well, right? And the only incentive that they get is to go and collect money from the street vendors. Improving police infrastructure. Failure of police infrastructure like vehicles, weaponry. Also, audits have found that the PolNet network is non-functional in various states. Police network. A portal of Polnet is the police network, and that is not as functional in various states. For example, an audit of the Gujarat Police Force reported that the network had not been operationalized till October 2015 due to non-installation of essential infrastructure, such as remote subscriber units and generator sets. So, because of infrastructure not being proper, they're not able to utilize their vehicles and weaponry, and also not being able to utilize the Polnet network. Funds dedicated for modernization of infrastructure are typically not utilized fully. For example, in 2015-2016, only 14% of such funds were used by the states. Such is the pathetic way of utilizing these funds. The IPS officers who were once civil service aspirant, they would have read all these things, but still they don't go to whenever they go to the service. Not all, but some do not actually implement these kind of provisions. They know the lacunae in the system, but they do not do it. So God knows what is the reason. Probably they fear their job, they fear the politicians above them, and all these factors can be taken into consideration. They fear from being posted to another place so that their kids' education does not disturb, their family doesn't get disturbed. So these kind of nexus happens, and end of the day, it is the people who face the brunt of inefficiency. Right, the political influence. Second Administrative Reforms Commission has noted that ministers have used police forces for personal and political reasons. Ministers use police to drop their kids to schools and colleges. Police accountability. Police forces have the authority to exercise force to enforce laws and maintain law and order in a state. However, this power may be misused in several ways. Poor quality of investigation. Crime per lakh population has increased by 28% over the last decade, that is between 2005 to 2015. However, convictions have been low, so it shows the poor quality of investigation. The Law Commission and Second Administrative Reforms Commission have noted that the state police officers often neglect investigation because they are understaffed and overburdened with various kinds of tasks. And even if they take up that investigation, it is going to be dragged for so long, and they would be giving reasons such as the forensic science laboratories results are not out, and there is not enough resources to investigate, and all these kind of things. So end of the day, a person who has been aggrieved with a specific offense does not get justice at all. The case would also be pending in the court, and it goes on, and it drags for almost 20 years in India. Further, they lack the training and expertise required to conduct professional investigation. They also have insufficient legal knowledge and forensic and cyber infrastructure available to them, which is both inadequate and outdated. In light of this, police forces may use force and torture to secure evidence. Crime investigations may be influenced by political or other extraneous considerations. right? If at all a person of the political party is involved, just imagine the kind of investigation that the police does. Forensic labs, like I just mentioned, short of funds and unqualified staff is there in the labs, and there is indiscriminate referencing of cases to these labs, resulting in high pendency. Lack of coordination between center and states is a matter related to maintenance of law and order, results in ineffective functioning of police force. Police force is not in the position to tackle present problems of cybercrime, global terrorism, Naxalism because of structural weaknesses. Recently, the CRPF Jawans were also killed in the Naxal attack. And here we can see that there was a structural weakness, that how did the CRPF commandant did not get enough information about a possible attack there. So there are structural weaknesses. The prevalence of rank system within the police force results in abuse of power by top level executive or lower level personnel, especially IPS officers take the constabulary for granted. They treat them in a harsh way, they scold them, they do not give respect to them. So whenever that thing happens, there are no incentives for the constable. So they tend to be very harsh to the public. So whatever seniors say to them, it comes on to the common public, that is us. Reforms needed. Directions of the Supreme Court in Prakash Singh versus Union of India. Some of the reforms were suggested. It said that fixing the tenure and selection of the DGP to avoid situations where officers about to retire in a few months are given the post. So fixing of tenure is very much important. In order to ensure no political interference, a minimum tenure was sought for the Inspector General of Police so that they are not transferred midterm by politicians. Minimum tenure is required. Fixing the tenure is also required. Posting of officers should be done by police establishment boards and not by politicians' will and wish, comprising police officers and senior bureaucrats to insulate powers of postings and transfers from political leaders. Set up a state police complaints authority to give a platform where common people aggrieved by police action could approach. Right, this is very important because common people doesn't have a place to go. All that they can do is go to the media and tell it out, but how much can the media also report about these kind of excesses? And so there should be a state police complaints authority where it takes the feedback from the people on the way the police is conducting its actions. Separate investigation and law and order functions have to be to better improve policing. Set up a state security commission that would have members from civil society. Form a national security commission. So this commissions and authorities will just push the problem for one department to another department, but these departments which have been set up, they should also again act accordingly with conscience and with loyalty to the people and accountable to the people, and not again being accountable to the politicians. So you are just shifting the goalpost from one place to another if these authorities also do not perform the tasks as intended. That needs to be functioned. Independent Complaints Authority, the Second Administrative Reforms Commission, and the Supreme Court have observed that there is a need to have an independent complaints authority to inquire into cases of police misconduct. Example is that if the New York City Police, which has a civilian complaint review board comprising of civilians appointed by the local government bodies and the police commissioner to investigate into cases of police misconduct. So who will investigate the cases of police misconduct? We have to take an example from New York City Police, where they have a civilian complaint review board. Investigation experts have recommended that states must have their own specialized investigation units within the police force that are responsible for crime investigation. Next is Padmanabh Bhaiya Commission. Remember this commission's name, it is very important. It has also been recommended that constables and police force in general should receive greater training in soft skills, given they need to deal with the public regularly. More than the IPS officers, more than the inspectors, more than the circle inspectors, more than the DYSP, it is the constables that constantly interact with the common public. Housing, importance of providing housing to the constabulary and generally to the police force to improve their efficiency and incentive to accept remote postings has also been emphasized by expert bodies such as National Police Commission. Community policing, Jan Maitri Suraksha in Kerala. This project is an initiative of the Kerala Police to facilitate greater accessibility, close interaction, and better understanding between the police and local communities. A very welcome step. Jan Maitri Suraksha in Kerala. So these beat constables are required to know at least one family member of every family living in his beat area. Mira Paibi, torch bearers in Assam, the women of the Manipuri Basti in Guwahati helped with improving the law and order problem in their area by tackling drug abuse among the youth. So this Mira Paibi, torch bearers in Assam, you translate it as torch bearers. And this woman of Manipuri Basti in Guwahati helped with improving the law and order problem in their area by tackling drug abuse among the youth. They light their torches and go around the Basti, guarding the entry and exit points to prevent the youth of the area from going out after sunset. The Madras High Court has said that the state government should contemplate giving policemen So the Madras High Court has said that the state government should contemplate giving policemen a day off in a week like other government officials in order to spend time with their families. So one day off is very much required. The court suggested introducing an 8-hour 3-shift system for police personnel. It will help them rejuvenate themselves and relieve them from the stress. Evidence based policing is gaining credibility day by day. Indian police force must be exposed to it. Second, ARC recommended that the government should declare certain crimes as federal and entrust their investigation to the central agency. For example, we can take up money laundering or corruption and directly entrusted to the central agency, that is CBI. Police need to have the operational freedom to carry out their responsibilities professionally and satisfactorily working conditions while being held accountable for poor performance or misuse of power. Gender parity in police force. The Second Administrative Reform Commission recommended that the representation of women in police at all levels should be increased through affirmative action so that they constitute about 30 to 33% of the police at least. Second, ARC suggests a lot of things. First is it tells you to declare certain crimes as federal and also help improve the number of women in the police force at least to 33% of the police. Improvement in intelligence gathering. The intelligence gathering machinery in the field needs to be strengthened and at the same time made more accountable. Human intelligence should be combined with information derived from diverse sources, not just technological intelligence but also the intelligence of the society, wherein a person has to be kept in every community so that he can come and report those kind of small things that police might miss out. Conclusion: the police force needs to be freed from the stranglehold of the executive and given functional autonomy to enforce the rule of law. Police should be a smart police, as police which should be strict and sensitive, modern and mobile, alert and accountable, reliable and responsible, tech savvy and trained. That is the kind of police we need for the 21st century. The next topic is of General Studies 3. Under this, we will be talking about how can we revive the rural economy by improving the land record system. Okay, so that is the question. Discuss the possible role that improved land record system can play to help revive the rural economy in India. This article appeared in Indian Express. Let's have a look at this thing. So earlier, how were the land records kept? First of all, there were no land records at all. Then when the British came into picture, they started maintaining paperwork. And then in this 21st century, the governments have made sure that all the land records become digitized. So how can this digitization help in improving reviving the rural economy? What is the reason why? Because land is the primary source of income in the rural areas. And if there are disputes between two people on a specific land, if this goes to a court, then court will put a stay on utilizing that land. So none of those parties can utilize that land. And when none of the party are actually utilizing that land for agriculture, what will happen? There will be no production, no agricultural output. And because of this, the economy takes a hit. So how do we, rectify this land record system to help revive the rural economy is the main agenda of this question. Digitization of land records was introduced to computerize all land records, including mutations, improve transparency in the land records maintenance system, digitization of maps and surveys, update all settlement records, and minimize the scope of land disputes. One of the main contentious issue. This would provide clear titles of land ownership that could be monitored easily by government officials, facilitate quicker transactions, and reduce disputes. Most importantly, it would reduce construction timelines and overall cost for the developer if there are no land disputes, the benefits of which can be transferred to consumer, making property prices more attractive. If somebody wants to buy a land in a specific area, if the land records are not proper, it hesitates to buy that particular land. And when nobody buys a particular land, what happens? The rates of that land will not go up. There won't be demand in purchasing of land, and the land will all be left, barren. There will be no production. There will be no development. Nobody will go and start the factory, or they're fearing that the villagers might again come back and put a case in the courts. So these kind of litigations might happen, and that is the reason people prefer having a proper land record. Computerization of land records, modernization of land record system management system, unique identification number for property, digitized cadastral maps, computerized land record, computerized registration records. So what are the things that we just saw? Management system has to be put in place. Identification number for a particular property should be there, and the maps have to be digitized, and the land records have to be computerized, and registration records are also to be computerized. Nothing has to be done in the paperwork format. Even if it is done, it has to be converted to a soft copy in the computer. What is the need for digitization of land records? High litigation. A World Bank study from 2007 states that some estimates suggest that land related disputes account for two-thirds of all pending court cases in the country. More than two-thirds of all pending court cases in the country is regarding land-related disputes. Because let's say a family had 10 acres of land and they had to distribute it among three children. Now this became three. That is almost it got divided into 3 acres, and those three people will have further kids, so that will be divided into one. Now somebody feels that I want more, and the other person wants more, and some people do not even give the land to their daughters, and they hand it over to the sons. So all these disputes and this disputes constitute about two-thirds of all pending court cases in the country. A Niti Aayog paper suggests that land disputes on average take about 20 years to be resolved. Land disputes add to the burden of the courts, tie up land in litigation, and further impact sectors and projects that are dependent on these disputed land titles. Right? We just discussed about it. Agricultural credit, land is often used as a collateral for obtaining loans by farmers. Now, if it is in a dispute, no bank will give money to actually do agriculture, or also to build a particular building over there. Small and marginal farmers who account for more than half of the total land holdings may not hold formal land titles, are unable to access institutionalized credit. Now, let's say you know that the land belongs to you, but there are no proper records. Now you cannot even take this. You cannot go to the bank and tell that I have land and give me loans. So the bank will not give. So with no proper records, you will not get loans. With no proper records, you will not be able to sell your land. With proper records but dispute, you will not be able to develop anything on that land. Development of new infrastructure. Land that was earlier used for farming is now being used to set up industries, power plants, housing, build roads, and shopping malls. However, several of the new infrastructure projects are witnessing delays, with land related issues after often being a key factor. These delays occur because of non-availability of encumbrance-free land. That means evidence that the property in question is free from any monetary and legal liability, non-updation of land records, resistance to joint measurement survey of land records, demands for higher compensation by landowners, and filling up a large number of arbitration cases by landowners. So all these help in reducing the possibility of utilizing the land for further development. For example, obtaining a land ownership certificate can take around 60 days in Gujarat and up to 12 months in Chennai and Odisha. So there is disparity within the country in terms of obtaining a land ownership. Some states give it out very easily, whereas in other states it takes almost a year. Urbanization and housing shortage. More recently, land use is also changing due to urbanization and further expansion of such urban areas. Earlier, there were individual houses. Now we have apartments where in a single 1 acre of land, there are hundreds of families living. While census towns are places with urban characteristics, population above 5,000, at least 75% of the population engaged in non-agricultural work, a population density of at least 400 people per square kilometers. Statutory towns are urban areas with a local authority. There is shortage for uh, for population, and there is huge amount of density, increasing amount of pressure on the land. Under new schemes for urban development, Smart Cities Mission, Amrut Mission, cities are trying to raise their own revenue through property taxes and land-based financing. This further necessitates the importance of providing a system of clear land titles in urban areas. Next is Benami transactions. A Benami transaction is one where a property is held by or transferred to a person but has been provided for or paid by another person. Right. So, white paper on black money 2012 had noted that black money generated in the country gets invested in Benami properties. Usually, politicians utilize this Benami kind of transactions. They give it out to their people who help him to become an MLA. He writes the property in their name so that the investigation authorities don't directly come knocking at his door. Unclear titles and non-updated land records enable carrying out property transaction in a non-transparent way. Once the digitization happens, the Benami transactions can be clearly identified, and the investigating authorities can take necessary action on the person who has a specified land, which is different from the income that he gets. The Standing Committee on Finance 2015, examining the Benami Transactions Prohibition Amendment Bill 2015, noted that generation of black money through Benami transactions could be preempted and eliminated by digitization of land records and the regular updation. Unused land, a large proportion of government land lies unused. A large part of the unused land is high value property in prime areas in major cities. Land hoarding by the government agency has created artificial scarcity and is one of the main drivers of skyrocketing urban real estate prices. Let's have a look at the challenges in digitization of land records. Till now, we saw what are the problems that happens if the land records are not digitized. Now, let's have a look at the challenges in creating this digitization of land records. In India, we have a system of registered sale deeds and not land titles. The Transfer of Property Act 1882 provides that the right to an immovable property or land can be transferred or sold only by a registered document. These documents are registered under the Registration Act 1908. Therefore, the transaction gets registered and not the land title, only the transaction. See, again, we are missing out this possibility of land coming into picture of the document. We're just, recording the transaction. This implies that even bona fide property transactions may not always guarantee ownership, as earlier transactions could be challenged. Right? I might sell the same property to somebody else, right, and create this kind of challenges. Land ownership is established through multiple documents maintained by different departments, making it cumbersome to access them. For example, sale deeds are stored in the registration department, maps are stored in the survey department, and property tax receipts are with the revenue department. So, multi departments, multiple confusions. These departments work in silos and do not update the data in a timely manner, which results in discrepancies. One has to go back to several years of documentation to find out any ownership claims on a piece of property, which causes delays. Right. So recently, Assam had the CAA bill, and they checked the Citizenship Amendment Act and saw if anybody who has the land title in their name, they're considered to be the citizens of Assam. But like we saw, a lot of land records are not digitized, and even if the land records are there, the transaction is recorded but not the land title. So these kind of complications can also be related to CAA. Right. So next is the department work in silos. We just saw it. The cost of registering property is high, and hence people avoid registering transactions. While registering a sale deed, the buyer has to pay a stamp duty along with registration fee. In India, stamp duty rates across states vary between 4% and 10% compared to 1% and 4% in other countries. The registration fee is an additional 0.5% or 2% on average. So huge amount of costs apart from the money spent on the land. Under the Registration Act 1908, registration of property is not mandatory for transactions such as the acquisition of land by the government, property leased for less than 1 year, and hireship partitions. What are the benefits of proper land records to citizen? It will give real-time land ownership records which will be available to citizen, and he can go ahead and take loans from the bank. And if at all he wants to fund his daughter's wedding or education, property owners will have free access to the records without any compromise in regard to confidentiality of the information. Free accessibility to the records will reduce interface between citizen and government functionaries, thereby reducing rent seeking and harassment. So directly you can go to the portal, log in, and download the document that you want. This method will permit e-linkages to credit facilities. Market value information will be available on the website to the citizen. Certificates based on land data, example domicile, caste, income, etc., will be available to the citizen through computers. Information on eligibility for government programs will be available based on the data. It will help in transparent land records management with a single window to handle land records, which will include maintenance and updation of maps, survey, and registration of property. It can also aid online approvals of plans and occupancy certificates. It will help in showcasing the ownership status and ease overall business process in the sector. And it will also help developers and buyers who would like to, construct something on the property. Digitization will also make both domestic and cross-border transactions time-bound with a click of a button. Government efforts on the digitization of land records so far are: one is the Samitva scheme. The land digitization efforts in India received a new boost at both the center and state levels after the launch of a survey of villages and mapping with improved technology. Short form, it is called as Swamitva scheme last year. The scheme seeks to confer land titles in so far unmapped, uninhabited areas of rural India and to distribute property cards in villages. Very good. Have this thing in mind. Swamitva and property cards in villages. The Digital India Land Records Modernization Program was launched by the Government of India in August 2008. The objective of the program was to streamline and reduce the scope of land in property disputes, thereby improving transparency in the maintenance of land records. The main aim of the program was to computerize all land records, digitize maps, upgrade the survey and settlement records, and sustain the same. Karnataka was the first state in India to computerize land records under the Bhumi project, followed by Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu in the year 2001. So let's give it a big round of applause to these states for taking up such a challenging task. Madhya Pradesh, West Bengal, and Odisha are the best performing Indian states in land record digitization, according to an annual land records index prepared by Delhi based think tank National Council of Applied Economic Research. The NCAER's Land Records and Services Index 2020-2021 released recently said nearly all states and union territories, that is 29 out of 32, showed a gradual improvement in their efforts to digitize land records compared to the previous year. Let's conclude it. A good land record system is necessary for any harmonious and progressive society. The book would ultimately lead to an improved land government system, reduction in land disputes, prevention of Benami transaction, and a comprehensive integrated land information management system in the country by sharing best practices. Let's move on to the next question, and this is about India's manufacturing capabilities and export competitiveness through production linked scheme. Once this coronavirus pandemic struck India, the government started thinking about how to improve the manufacturing sector in India, and that is where this thing called production linked scheme came into picture, wherein where it shows that the number of products that you produce in the country, based on that we would be giving incentives to you, whether it's on the tax or anything else. So production linked scheme, incentive scheme, is being carried out in India, and we'll have to critically examine this scheme in raising India's manufacturing capabilities and export competitiveness. Okay. Now let's have a look at the answer to this question. In the past few decades, manufacturing sector has underperformed when compared to other nations. True, because we grew in services much faster than the manufacturing sector. Usually, the countries move from agriculture to manufacturing, but India moved directly from agriculture to services, leaving behind manufacturing. That is why it is said that India is still not, it is still considered to be a developing nation. In the past few decades, like we said, manufacturing sector has underperformed when compared to other nations, with a meager share of 16 to 17% of the GDP. This is much lesser than China and Korea, whose manufacturing is almost 29% of the GDP and 27% in Thailand. Currently, this sector accounts for only 12% of the total employment of the workforce. Our India is mostly known for services. Let's have a look at the body of this answer. India has to promote the sufficient manufacturing depth. India has three Ds, that is democracy, demography, and demand. Democracy, which means we have a fantastic constitution where equal rights and liberal thoughts are given. Demography, we have a young population, wherein it is said that almost 60% of the India's population is below 35 years of age, and the median age in India is 28 years old. And so we have these three Ds, and demand also, because of the youthful population, the demand is also more to consume. For example, we are ready to consume internet, we are ready to consume whatever videos are there on YouTube, and this has to be translated in the manufacturing sector also. 65% of India's population is below the age of 35, an advantage when compared to other countries. Studies have shown that every job created in the manufacturing sector has a multiplier effect in creating 2 to 3 jobs in the service sector. High domestic demand, increasing middle class, and young population and high returns make India attractive to the manufacturers. And that is why a lot of these mobile phone manufacturing companies are in India today, because of the huge amount of demand, because of the middle class, rising middle class, and also the young population who want these mobile phones to make TikTok videos or YouTube videos and upload it online and showcase their skills. The manpower cost is low when compared to other nations, and that is why these companies are coming to India. In order to be self-reliant, India needs sufficient manufacturing depth. Depth in manufacturing provides security against foreign threats. It is the foundation for sustainable competitiveness in international trade, and it provides pathways for wages to rise. India needs all the three, and now is the time to address this. Right? China and India are the only two countries in the world with populations of over 1 billion. These provide a large potential market, also a large workforce to produce for the world market and for their own. The growth trajectories of Asian neighbors reveal how far behind India has fallen over the past 3 decades. In 1990, India's manufacturing sector was comparable with China's. Since then, China's manufacturing sector has grown almost 10 times larger and its capital goods and machine tool sectors to almost 50 times. Not only has China become the factory of the world, selling labor intensive products across the planet, it has also developed high tech manufacturing capabilities in electronics, telecom, power equipment, and machine tools. It is this depth of its manufacturing capabilities that has made it a threat to the West and also to the India. Indian policymakers are concerned with sluggishness in growth of domestic manufacturing and employment. They are alarmed by the inroads of Chinese industries in India's economy, as well as China's troops on the border, and also the Belt and Road Initiative, where it is trying to send across all the products that the China makes to other countries and expand its trade. Yeah, Atmanirbhar policy and Make in India have become national security imperatives. While India is being criticized by its own economists for turning protectionist again, other nations have been closing up faster. A Mint report cited earlier ranks countries on a protectionist index. The difference between their number of restrictive and liberalizing interventions between 2018 and 2020. On top is the US with 591, Canada 450, Germany 436, UK 272, China 209, and India at 166. India is ranked better than other countries in terms of protectionist. Potential of production linked incentive scheme in India in making India self reliant. So it's thrust in the right direction for being self reliant. It would depend on its design, and also incentives are linked only to volumes of additional production, will promote simple assembly and other low value adding cooperations. This would not meet India's strategic need for industrial depth because it is only on volumes, and incentives must be tied to progressive increase in value addition also. And present policy does not explicitly link the quantum of incentives with domestic value addition. PLI payments should be made to companies in proportion to their domestic value addition. So value addition is there, then PLI payment should be made. Companies doing assembly or low level manufacturing will have lower value addition. We just saw that. PLI incentive is determined by a percentage increase in production over a base year, and the base year should not be zero because even small additions will amount to large percentage increases, and so therefore there should be a minimum threshold level. And company already has some track record of growth and uses incentives well for further expansion. There should be R&D. Spend should be seen as capital investment, including manpower. Such investment can generate at least 5 times greater return on investment. And PLI scheme is intended to attract foreign direct investments and scale up the domestic industry. So there will be more amount of money that is coming into country. And to ensure that both are equally promoted, perhaps 50% of the PLI incentive should be reserved for domestic companies and not just to the foreign companies. The only sustainable competitive advantage a company or a country can have in open markets is an ability to learn faster than competitors. Fastest learners in the world to catch up this their Chinese counterparts among them. So there should be incentive for that also. And policymakers must also become much faster learners and not remain stuck in theoretical paradigm of free trade. Government initiatives to promote manufacturing sector, Make in India, Skill India, Shram Suvidha, Random Inspection Scheme, Universal Account Number, Apprentice Protsahan Yojana. All these schemes are an initiative to promote manufacturing sector. Make in India, the flagship scheme of government of India, wanted to make India the global manufacturing hub, and it also aims to increase the sector's GDP to 25%. Like we saw, it is 29% in China. At least we'll have to reach 25% from the existing 16% and create almost 100 million new jobs by 2022. Skill India aims to create jobs and promote entrepreneurship within India. Shram Suvidha is a web portal that provides a single platform for all labor law compliances. Other labor reform initiatives like Random Inspection Scheme, Universal Account Number, and Apprentice Protsahan Yojana. Defense procurement policy prioritizes the promotion of indigenous defense technology. National manufacturing policy also we have for promote provides for a technology acquisition and development fund that facilitates the acquisition of clean, green, and energy efficient technology by MSMEs. Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana provides loans for small businesses. Startup India scheme objective is to generate employment and promote economic development. It seeks for the development and innovation of products and services and aims to increase the employment rate in India. Stand Up India aims to promote entrepreneurship also, but among the women and SC/ST communities. That is the difference between startup and stand up. So India's manufacturing sector needs upgradation and reforms for becoming globally competitive. Absence of effective, flexible, and targeted policy support, along with supportive measures like the development of infrastructure and education, mean the stagnation of the sector. The government needs to address the core problems of the landmark initiatives like Make in India and Skill India to work and manufacturing sector to grow. Next thing that we'll be looking at is on the climate change. So it's almost 1 hour. So this is one of the longest YouTube video that I've made, and hopefully it becomes effective for you. Right. So let's, without any delay, let me finish this off. Let me not continue it for more than 1 hour. So climate change actions should ensure distributive, commutative, and corrective justice rather than focusing on net zero emission targets, which is unjust for developing countries. So most of the developed countries are already developed. They have already spoiled the air, water, and everything on the planet Earth. Now they want the developing countries also to follow through and put in practices which does not affect the climate change. So we just now, for developing countries, it is very unjust to look at the net zero emission targets. Rather, our actions should be to ensure distributive, commutative, and corrective justice. Let's have a look at the answer to this question. Recently, 58 countries announced net zero emission targets. In the next 30 years, they aim to reduce their emissions of climate change causing carbon dioxide and other GHGs and remove what they do emit through planting trees or advanced technologies. So one way is to plant trees and then have advanced technologies, because for example solar panels. Together these countries account for more than half of the world's current GHG emissions. Let's have a look at the body of this answer. The idea of net zero emissions by 2050 is being advocated as a panacea for the evil of climate change. While the feasibility and efficacy of such a strategy for all countries is questionable, it also strikes at the root of the basic tenets of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Simultaneously, it determines the achievement of a climate just world. Challenges of transitioning into zero carbon economy. India and other developing countries have struggled hard to ensure differentiation between the developed and developing countries and enshrine the principles of equity and CBDR-RC in the Paris Agreement. Right. Next is so, while many herald the call for the net zero by 2050 as a positive signal in avoiding runaway climate breakdown, in reality, it delays climate action by developed countries and is being used to evade historical responsibility and transfer burdens to developing countries. The developed countries are trying to transfer the burden on the developing countries. The catch is that 25% of the center's tax revenue comes from energy sector. So, weaning away from fossil fuels will also deplete the government's coffers. Right. The climate action tracker reports that climate action of major developed countries is incompatible with the goals of the Paris Agreement. It is only a few developing countries, including India, who are taking adequate climate action. Therefore, the focus should be on ensuring ambitious climate action by developed countries in the near term to ensure distributive climate change justice and the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Climate justice demands that every individual who is born on this earth has a right to development and dignified living. For this, developed countries need to repay the climate debt by shouldering greater mitigation responsibilities and providing finance, technology, and capacity building support to safeguard the interest of the poor and vulnerable people in developing countries. So it is the responsibility of the developed nations to hand over the funding to the developing nations. So because of the historical wrongs that they have done. Job gains might not occur in the same locations as job losses. Women whose participation in the workforce has been harder hit in the pandemic may not easily be able to access certain new jobs. Most new jobs are expected to be non unionized, often lacking safety nets. Carbon tax revenues may need to be recycled back to poorer households who spend a large fraction of their income on energy. What are the measures that are needed? First is focus on energy efficiency. We'll need energy efficient buildings, lighting, appliances, and industrial practices to meet the net zero goal. Increase usage of biofuels. Promote the usage of biofuels. This can help in reducing emissions from light commercial vehicles, tractors in agriculture. In aviation, the only practical solution for reducing emissions is greater use of biofuels until hydrogen technology gains scale. Carbon sequestration. India will have to rely on natural and man-made carbon sinks to soak up these emissions. Greece can capture zero point 0.9 billion tons. The country will need carbon capture technologies to sequester the rest. Carbon pricing. India, which already taxes coal and petroleum fuels, should consider putting a tax on emissions to drive change. Deploying lower carbon energy. There are four main types of low carbon energy: wind, solar, hydro, and nuclear. The first three are renewable, which means that these are good for the environment as natural resources are used to produce electricity. Deploying lower carbon energy would help address both domestic and international climate challenges while it simultaneously improving the economic well-being of India's citizens. Now, what is the way forward for India? Given the massive shifts underway in India's energy system, we would benefit from taking stock of our situation actions and focusing on near-term transitions. This will allow us to meet and even over-comply with our 2030 target while also ensuring concomitant development benefits, such as developing a vibrant renewable industry. We can start putting in place the policies and institutions necessary to move us in the right direction for longer term and also better understand through modeling and other studies the implications of net zero scenarios before making an net zero pledge. So it would also be in India's interest to link any future pledge to the achievement of a near-term action by industrialized countries. That would be fair and consistent with principles of UNFCCC and also enhance the feasibility of our own actions through, for example, increasing availability and reducing costs of new mitigation technologies. Let's conclude this session with the conclusion of this answer. The world is not going to achieve its targets of halting global warming unless India is able to reduce its carbon emissions. And India changes its trajectory right now. India is now rightly recognized for having come of age and becoming a major global power. But coming of age also brings with it the ability to take a stand and resist being buffeted by the winds of shifting political agendas. While we, like others, have a responsibility to the international community, we also have a responsibility to our citizens to be deliberate and thoughtful about a decision as consequential as India's climate pledge. Thank you for being part of this video. If you like this video, please press the like button and also subscribe to my channel. Until then, see you tomorrow. I'll be coming up with a new video and giving out information to you guys. Thank you.